The story of the first mass shooting of the Holocaust is truly repulsive. The troops of the Third Reich, advancing towards the heart of the USSR in the fall of 1941, had taken Kyiv on September 19th. Just 10 days later, the mobile death squads, Einsatzgruppen-C, supported by the SS and local collaborators, carried out the Babi Yar massacre on the outskirts of Kyiv. This atrocity was the largest crime of the Third Reich and its Ukrainian partners at that time, with an estimated but unconfirmed number of over 100,000 victims, executed to annihilate the entire Jewish population of the capital of Ukraine within 48 hours. That massacre marked a qualitative leap in the Holocaust. Today, we will tell you everything about the Babi Yar massacre and hear the chilling testimonies of those responsible during the subsequent trials in Kyiv. This is military history. Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, had been a center of anti-Semitism in Europe since ancient times. In the 19th century, Ukrainian Jews were victims of looting and lynching during the era of Tsarist Russia and were also targeted by the White Army's anger during the Russian Civil War between 1919 and 1923. With the founding of the Soviet Union and Stalin coming to power, things did not improve, as communist propaganda blamed them for the famine caused by the Holodomor between 1932 and 1934, resulting in millions of deaths. The Soviet narrative also accused them of conspiring with the Third Reich when the Germans invaded the USSR in 1941, as absurd as it sounds, since they were supposedly the cause of the German invasion. On September 19, 1941, German forces entered the city of Kyiv. Like much of the Ukrainian territory occupied by the Germans, the city was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, established on September 1st. When the Wehrmacht marched into Kyiv on September 26, 1941, after a bloody battle against the Red Army, the anti-Semitic atmosphere was already extremely heated. First, due to previous Marxist propaganda, and second, because of the thousands of Ukrainian nationalists who accused the Jews of being accomplices of Russian communism and, consequently, guilty of all the evils Ukraine had suffered at the hands of Stalin. If this were not enough, the German invaders were even more racist than the local population, who welcomed them by throwing flowers and applauding, creating a cocktail of hatred that would turn into tragedy. From the moment the German army took control of Kyiv, numerous Ukrainian nationalists attacked or jeered at the city's Jews, forcing them to undergo public humiliations, demonstrating that the threat was not only German. However, during the first week of the Nazi occupation in Kyiv, something happened that would lead to tragedy. Two large and unexpected explosions destroyed the German headquarters and the areas surrounding the main street in the city center. A significant number of German soldiers and officers died as a result of the explosions. Although these were caused by mines left by the Soviets in their retreat, the Germans blamed the Jews and used that sabotage as a pretext to implement a plan to annihilate the remaining Jewish community. In Kyiv, Babi Yar, or Grandmother's Ravine, was the location chosen by the Algemeen SS for the mass extermination. As a secluded and discreet place on the outskirts of the capital, right next to a psychiatric hospital and a prison, it was perfect for killing thousands of people and making their bodies disappear into the depths of those wide, natural gorges. The most sinister part is that the victims had to dig their own graves. The Einsatzgruppe-C, led by General Otto Rasch, was in charge of this vile operation with its 4 detachments dividing the tasks. Sonderkommando 4A and 4B would gather the urban Jewish population of Kyiv to take them to the ravines, while Einsatzkommando 5 and 6 would carry out the shootings through successive volleys. Alongside these German forces, the Ukrainian police of Kyiv and the local militia of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists would also participate in the massacre, performing auxiliary, escort, and security tasks. Let's hear how one of the officers explained the procedure.
Wir hätten die jüdische Bevölkerung zu sammeln und zu erschießen. Dass ich mich in Lemberg an der Haussuchung zu beteiligen habe und fernerhin späterhin an der Erschießung.
Surprisingly, 24 hours before the start of the Babi Yar massacre on September 27, 1941, the SS sought to erase evidence of what was about to happen in the ravines. A small detachment stormed and evacuated the nearby psychiatric hospital, killing the 752 patients and mentally ill who could have witnessed what was going to happen 2 days later. Meanwhile, on the following day, it was announced through a series of posters hung throughout the city of Kyiv with the message, "All Jews residing in Kyiv and its surroundings must present themselves tomorrow, Monday, at 8 in the morning, at the corner of Melnikovsky and Doktorov streets. They must carry their documents, money, valuables, and also warm clothing. Any Jew who does not comply with these instructions and is found elsewhere will be shot. Any civilian who enters the properties evacuated by the Jews and steals their belongings will be shot." The reactions were horrifying, as narrated in the following testimony.
Видел объявление от захватчиков Киева по адресу евреев. В этом объявлении было определенно сказано, что в такой-то день и час евреи должны собраться на еврейском кладбище, беря с собою необходимые вещи и ценности. Особенно запечатлелась мне в памяти фигура одной женщины. Вид выражал крайнее отчаяние. Ее жалкие, истощенные руки были подняты, и она что-то кричала. Что она кричала, я не знаю. Она кричала по-еврейски. Но вся ее фигура выражала такой безумный ужас, такой предел человеческого отчаяния, что большей экспрессии этой эмоции я не представлял.
At 8:00 a.m. on Monday, September 29, 1941, the Day of Atonement, thousands of Jews gathered in the center of Kyiv, although many had been there for several hours before intending to get a better position. As innocently as it was terrifying, most of the summoned Jews mistakenly thought it was a deportation to another city's ghetto. It was clear that what was coming was going to be infinitely worse. However, both the Ukrainian police and armed nationalist militias made them walk to the outskirts of the capital near the municipal cemetery. Once there, German soldiers from Einsatzgruppe took charge of the Jews and ordered them to leave their suitcases and belongings by the fence of the area. At that point, many began to be alarmed by distant machine gun shots and noticed a German Air Force plane circling overhead like a cruel crow watching them. Unfortunately, there was no turning back because a checkpoint was set up at the exit, preventing them from leaving the area. They were ordered to form groups and walk along a path guarded by Ukrainian auxiliaries armed with clubs, who would beat them if they did not advance. Not only that, but they also insulted and spat on them. This was how the journey passed for 10 minutes, first through a dried-up grove, and then over a plain of tall grass until the prisoners finally reached the ravine to discover their terrible fate. After contemplating that steep and rocky slope of 30 meters in height, they discovered with horror that the bottom was crowded with the bodies of their neighbors and relatives. It was all death and pain, while for the soldiers, it was just routine work.
Die Erschießung ging wie folgt vor. Es wurden ungefähr 45 bis 50 Personen abgeteilt und zum Graben geführt. Sie wurden bis dicht an den Graben herangeführt, mussten sich mit dem Gesicht aufstellen und wurden so erschossen.
Next, the victims were forced to undress, with many pleading or embracing each other to say their goodbyes, before German soldiers fired a volley that made their lifeless bodies fall rolling onto the rest of the murdered. Officers approached to finish off the wounded, but later, to save ammunition, they began to throw dirt on them between layers of corpses so that the dying would ultimately suffocate amidst the dead and the soil. In just 48 hours, on September 29 and 30, 1941, Nazi forces alongside local collaborators killed about 33,700 Jews. This was how the Babi Yar massacre entered history in a sinister way, being one of the first steps towards Hitler's final solution. In this massacre, neither women nor children nor the elderly were spared, as recounted by one of the cruel executioners.
Die Eltern mussten sich in die Grube hinlegen mit dem Gesicht nach unten und wurden so erschossen. Die Kinder rissen die Männer aus den Armen ihrer Mütter und erschossen sie in ihren eigenen Händen. Die Erschießenden waren meistenteils besoffen. Die erschossen sie in ihren Händen und warfen sie in den Graben. Das habe ich nicht gesehen.
This massacre would not be the only one committed at Babi Yar. When political relations between the Third Reich and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists broke down in late 1941, it led to a brief war between them. In that conflict, the Germans captured 621 fighters from their former Ukrainian allies who were shot in the infamous ravine. Chillingly, that foul pit became a shared grave for victims and executioners. However, this event was only an exception because by 1942, German and Ukrainian soldiers agreed to peace and normalized their alliance to destroy Jews and opponents. Massive killings took place in the Babi Yar ravine for 2 years, starting from the September 1941 massacre. In this location, Germans stationed in Kyiv systematically executed tens of thousands of people, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Other groups of people killed at Babi Yar included Roma, or Gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians whom the SS or Einsatzgruppen wanted to eliminate. It is estimated that the victims at this site of horror were around 100,000 people, but some specialists and historians say the figure could be double. The true number is impossible to know with certainty because many corpses were cremated, and the Nazis eliminated evidence and exhumed bodies to cover their atrocities. As the Red Army approached Kyiv in August 1943, the Germans initiated a cover-up operation to conceal what had been happening at Babi Yar. To achieve this, they used the labor of inmates held at the Tsarist concentration camp, established in May 1942 to hold Soviet prisoners of war and Jews deemed useful. To cover up the mass shootings, the Germans ordered 321 Tsarist prisoners to dig mass graves, exhume partially decomposed bodies of victims, burn them, and then scatter their ashes in the same location. The process was torturous and inhumane, and most tragically, at the end of the work, the reward was to be executed and discarded alongside the victims in that accursed ravine. Killings there continued until the fall of 1943, just a few days before the Soviets regained control of Kyiv on November 6th. The Nazis and their Ukrainian collaborators did an efficient job trying to hide what had happened, but a few survivors managed to escape and go into hiding. Their survival was crucial as they could testify to these crimes before Soviet and American authorities to ensure these crimes did not go unpunished. After the war, several SS commanders who had planned and supervised the massacre were arrested and tried. Paul Blobel, the overall commander of the SS unit responsible for the massacre, was sentenced to death in the subsequent Nuremberg trials against the Einsatzgruppen and was hanged on June 7, 1951, in Landsberg prison. Otto Rasch was also charged in the Einsatzgruppen trial, but his case was suspended for health reasons, and he died in prison in 1948. Erich Koch, who had been Reichskommissar of Ukraine at that time, was tried and sentenced to death by a Polish court for his atrocities in occupied Poland, but was never tried for his crimes in Ukraine. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he died in prison in 1986. Tana Pronicheva, a Jewish survivor of the September massacre, testified in a Soviet court against the Ukrainian officers who had executed the massacre. In one of her written testimonies after the war, Pronicheva described what she saw at Babi Yar. "Every time I saw a new group of men and women, old and young, being forced to undress, they were all taken to an open pit where they were shot with machine guns. Then, another group was brought. I witnessed this horror with my own eyes. Although I wasn't standing near the pit, the terrible screams of people in a state of panic and the soft voices of children shouting, "Mother, mother," reached me. If her writing seemed chilling, even more terrible is hearing how she survived in the first person.
Нас повели к этой же песчаной двери, стали всех расстреливать. Я закрыла глаза, сжала кулаки, напрягла все мускулы и бросилась вниз до выстрела. Но я упала на трупы, благополучно, не расстрелянная. Через некоторое время, когда стрельба умолкла, я услыхала, что немцы спускаются вниз, в Яр, и расстреливают всех стонущих. Они присвечивали фонариками и достреливали всех. Я лежала тихо, не шевелясь, боясь выдать себя.
Later, Pronusheva was buried alive, but managed to surface and escape in the darkness, while the Nazis were busy shooting a new group of Jews. In January 1946, thanks to these trials and testimonies like Pronusheva's, 15 former members of the German police were tried in Kyiv for the crimes committed at Babi Yar. 12 of them were sentenced to death, and the other 3 received harsh prison sentences. The ones sentenced to death were publicly hanged in Kyiv City Square on January 29, 1946. Ukrainians decided to leave archival material of the moment, ensuring it remained recorded in the nation's memory.
За зверское истребление мирных советских граждан и военнопленных, за разрушение городов и сел, за угон в рабство населения Советской Украины. Военный трибунал приговорил к смертной казни через повешение. Товарищ комендант, приведите приговор в исполнение.
Despite these hangings, justice was not complete, as the vast majority of the actual perpetrators, young Nazis and racist Ukrainians, were never tried for their role in the massacre. This brings us to the end of this terrible story. Share your opinions in the comments below. We appreciate you reaching this point and look forward to the next installments of military history.